Hi everybody, welcome back to day 2 of Tnooz Live at GBTA, presented by BCD Travel. My name is Martin Cowing, I'm editorial director for Tnooz, and I'll be running you through the interviews this afternoon. A wide and varied selection of stakeholders from the corporate travel space lined up for you this afternoon. Delighted to kick off with Will Pinell, who's Vice President of TripSource and Traveller Engagement for BCD Travel. Will, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
So let's just kick off straight away with sort of mobile trends, and what have you noticed from a sort of corporate travel perspective over the past 12 months or so, new trends that have emerged, and also what do you think's sort of round the corner in terms of mobile in a corporate travel context?
Well, I think in general, we see travelers increasingly becoming less patient with the technologies they use. I think as their lives become more complex, they're looking for simplicity where they can find it. And so what we're starting to see is the consumerization of business travel, which has been happening now for a number of years. It feels like that's accelerating, that the solutions and the applications in the marketplace are becoming easier to use, void of friction. So anytime there's something that is difficult to do, either on a mobile device or having to switch back and forth between a PC and a mobile device, that friction typically results in travelers looking outside of a managed program. So I'm seeing increasingly, and if you walk around here at GBTA, you'll notice that increasingly there are products and services that are all about simplicity in their design. I think you also are starting to see creeping into mobile elements of artificial intelligence, machine learning, trying to anticipate what travelers want before they necessarily know what they need. So for example, rather than showing someone a flight that is canceled, you might have a probability of a flight being canceled and trying to be proactive with what we're sending to travelers and what we're seeing. So I think there's some of that that's starting to happen, and I suspect will continue to accelerate over the next 12 months.
Yep.
I also am starting to see companies building products and services on these different kinds of devices that make it very easy to pick up where they last left off, meaning you start a booking on one device and you can pick it up on another. Much like with an Apple device, you can start watching a movie on one device and pick it back up on another. I think that simplicity and that fluidness that you expect, again, in the consumer part of your life, you're starting to see in business travel.
Okay, so that consumerization, is that a sort of like a back-end functionality consumerization, or a sort of front-end design user interface?
Yeah, I think it's both. I think that what you're seeing increasingly with the cloud services is that most of that technology lives in the cloud, that these devices increasingly are simply the front end, the user interfaces that are taking that information down and making it accessible to the traveler. And so I think most of the heavy lifting is being done on the back end, on the server side, and the client side, the mobile device, the Android device, the iPad.
The simpler something is at the front end, the more complicated it is at the back end.
That's exactly right. That's a nice way to articulate it.
Okay, so as the Vice President of TripSource, I mean, just give us a brief idea for people who may not know what TripSource is, and just what have you sort of added to TripSource recently that you're sort of quite excited about? Yeah,
so TripSource is our mobile application and platform for travelers. So any BCD client has access to TripSource. It allows travelers to easily access their trip information, be able to engage with BCD digitally. In the past, if you needed service from any TMC, you'd have to pick up the phone and call a travel agent. Today, in addition to the online booking tools that are in the marketplace, we've supplemented that with TripSource, which is a nice companion for you when you travel. The ability to access travel documents, the ability to cancel your trip, the ability for you to chat with an agent. Those are all things that are coming to TripSource and making it easier for travelers to be able to navigate their corporate trips. We're seeing increasingly that travelers are using TripSource as a means to forego having to pick up the phone. That's functionality, of course, it's still there. It's easy to connect with an agent digitally in the app, so if you need to click to call, you can do that. But increasingly, travelers want to self-serve, and in many cases, the information is accessible to the traveler, they won't have the need to pick up the phone. I think we've seen lots of surveys and data points that would tell you that if given the choice between self-service and full service, increasingly people are moving to a self-service model.
Okay.
If
So
they can resolve it quickly, they can resolve it themselves.
I mean, so are we getting to the stage where there might be sort of mobile-only travel management companies?
I think, you know, there's a whole lot that has to happen in the background to make a travel management company work. The mobile device is simply kind of one interface. But I think, yes, I mean, the data would suggest that increasingly people, when they book their trips, when they engage their agencies, they're doing that digitally, and when they do that digitally, they're not necessarily doing that on a laptop or on a PC, they're doing that from an Android or an iPhone device. So I think you're going to see the primary way in which travelers engage their service providers is through mobile applications that they download, install on the devices. I think you also are seeing, and I've seen a few on the trade show floor, these the idea of kind of an appless world where the way you engage with your service provider is through text messaging or through SMS messages going back and forth, so that if you don't happen to have the app installed, you still have a way to engage and receive service. Depending on how frequently you travel, you may have the app downloaded. If you don't travel that frequently, a mobile website might work just as well. So for TripSource, for example, with us, all of the functionality and features that we have available in the native applications you download, you can access on the desktop or through the mobile web as well.
Okay, I mean, one of the things that I've sort of noticed in the limited time I've had on the trade show floor is there's a lot of talk around compliance, and there always seems to be talk around compliance in business travel.
Right.
And I'm just wondering, you know, to what extent can mobile help drive compliance?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two schools of thought on compliance. One is, and we have a variety of different clients, and compliance in some, with some clients is considered reverent. In others, it's a nasty word, depending on their company culture. And so what we typically see is the culture of a company defines sort of its travel policy in many cases. Many of our technology providers, for example, and infrastructure providers, they tend to have looser travel policies. Those that are government agencies or government contractors, which are very procurement and rules driven, have very tight travel policies. So I think the tools and services that we offer travelers, and I think again, if you, to your point around seeing others at the trade show, they're finding ways to make it easy for travelers to make good choices when they travel. And so whether you call that compliance or you call that sort of giving it a friendly nudge, I think inherently people want to make good choices when they travel. They just don't have their travel policy memorized. In fact, many people, the only time they ever read their travel policy is the day they start, when they get the HR packet and they flip to page 17, and 17 through 34 is the travel policy, and they read it once and forget it. And it exists somewhere on a company intranet or extranet site, but for the most part, people don't have easy access to it. So one of the things we've done as an example in TripSource is we make it easy for that travel policy to surface itself. So we've miniaturized it, we've made it mobile enabled, we've taken out key components like what is your per diem, what is the policy for returning your rental car with gasoline in it. Those kinds of things which people tend to forget or they don't know, we remind them in TripSource through the kind of mobile friendly versions. Plus we have push notifications sent at the right time in their itinerary. So you might land in New York, and at that point you're going to get a message from us which reminds you around what type of insurance you need to decline when you pick up the rental car. Okay. So smart messaging, I think, really drives that compliance and helps us with our clients saving money. Okay,
so I mean the push notifications and the having everything within a single solution such as TripSource, I mean that's all part of the engagement piece, presumably, that you're involved with. But I'm just wondering, in the same way as there's a lot of arguments at the moment around sort of personalization at scale, I mean I'm just wondering what engagement at scale, what the challenge is there. Is that a sort of, again, a back-end bandwidth issue? Is it more of a sort of cultural thing? I mean, how do you get engagement at scale when you're dealing with thousands of travelers within the same corporation?
Yeah, I think it requires a lot of upfront work in setting up a set of rules and policies in advance. So for example, we would have a client who'd say, I want to remind anyone flying into New York that the per diem for New York, let's say, is $75 a day. Well, we set up rules which would trigger off of Newark, JFK, LaGuardia, and those rules are structured in such a way that then when someone flies into that airport, those kinds of push notifications are sent. And so I think in terms of how you scale that, it requires, I think, a good amount of heavy lifting up front to think about what are the most important kinds of messages that you want your travelers to hear and see at the right point in their journey, and try to structure it in such a way that they're going to receive engaging messages that mean something to them, but that they're not bombarded by it. And that's always the trick, I think, with engagement is, how frequent is too frequent in terms of having your company tap you on the shoulder as you travel and remind you of what you're supposed to be doing. With our product, TripSource, we try to make that easy so that those are easy to dismiss. But being a push notification, it's convenient because it's not only sent as an example to your mobile device, but if you have a wearable device, those little push notifications get sent to your wrist. And so we're trying to balance what our clients want us to remind travelers to do with just making sure that travelers have a good experience. And we have a whole practice at Advito around traveler engagement and helping our clients put those kinds of programs together.
It's interesting that we started talking off about the consumerization of corporate travel and that whole idea of being engaged with the traveler, talking to them at the right point in the right tone at the stage in the journey is a very familiar conversation from leisure travel. So it's almost as if that's another aspect of the consumerization thing. So,
that's right. I mean, I think the one benefit that we have in corporate that you don't typically have in leisure is the personalization is, I think, easier to do in corporate, because in leisure travel, you typically, as a supplier, you don't know the intent of a journey. So when someone books a flight on British Airways, you're not sure why they're going from the UK to New York. With corporate travel, you have a good sense of the purpose of the trip and purpose. And so for us, that means the personalization, we have a history of, they've been to New York for 10 or 12 different times. We can start to see patterns. And again, being a theme here at GBTA this year, machine learning, artificial intelligence, having a big set of data in which we can go back and look at past behavior, it's indicative in corporate travel of future behavior. That's not so much true on leisure. For example, if you like Jamaica, you might also like Bermuda. You might make that jump on the leisure side, but if it's corporate, you go to Jamaica because you have a client there. So I think personalization becomes easier to do in corporate. Yeah,
that's a really interesting way to round off a really interesting 10 minutes there. Well, thanks very much for your time.
All right.
And I'll see you around.
Thank you.
So we'll be back shortly. This is tNooz Live at GBTA, presented by BCD Travel.